Welcome to the channel BL Story of Love. If you are here for the first time, pause for a second, hit subscribe and leave a like. That way you support stories where omegas stop being objects and alphas learn to take responsibility for their choices. Get comfortable, turn off the lights and let this story slowly pull you in. In the glass tower of the Volkov Group holding, morning started the same way. Streams of people, the chime of elevators, the quiet hum of meeting rooms. In this finely tuned mechanism, the Omega secretary named Lev was an invisible detail. He arrived earlier than everyone else so that by the time his alpha boss made the first call, fresh coffee was already waiting, reports were printed, and the day's schedule was cleaned of unnecessary chaos. Lev was considered the perfect employee. He remembered details, knew how not to ask extra questions, always looked neat and neutral. His biography contained nothing but work and a couple of lines about a rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. No one expected ambition from him, no one expected rebellion. His presence was valued precisely because there was no noise around him. His alpha boss, Roman Volkov, was the complete opposite. Tall, collected, with a reputation as a ruthless manager and an unfailing predator. He held the holding the same way he held the agenda, hard, precise, with no right to weakness. The press loved his image. Newspapers wrote about him as a young alpha ruler who had taken the family business to a new level. He had a legal marriage, beautiful, loud, proper. His husband, also an Omega, was part of that image. Photos from charity dinners, joint interviews, a carefully constructed narrative about a progressive couple who had everything under control. On screen it looked flawless. Lev saw that shop window only from a distance. His world had clear zones, his desk in front of the office door. Corridors he ran through with folders, the kitchen where he managed to eat on the go. Everything else, the floors where big decisions lived, expensive design, family secrets, remained behind glass. In Lev's life, there were no extra supports. The family he could lean on was gone. His Omega status and lack of connections made him a perfect target for control. Working for Volkov was both salvation and a trap. The salary allowed him to pay for housing and treatment of chronic health problems. But any conflict with management would mean an immediate fall downwards into the world where cheap agencies sold Omegas into the dirtiest positions. So he learned to feel his boss's mood by his footsteps and short phrases. When Roman entered the office, Lev already knew whether he should approach, whether he should remind him about meetings, whether he should bring reports now, or wait until after the first conference call, when that specific dangerous crunch in the alpha's voice disappeared. On the day when everything began to fall apart, the morning looked no different from any other. Lev came in early, fine-tuned the schedule, checked the mail. But the silence in the corridor was different. Security looked more tense than usual. Assistants whispered, quickly closing messengers when he approached. Roman appeared later than he usually did, but he entered with the cold, compressed energy of a man who had spent the entire night in battle. In his scent, in his gait, in the way he threw his briefcase onto the table, there was something Lev could not name, but clearly felt. The first crack had run across the polished surface of the family image. He leaned forward just a little, the way a person does who promised himself not to intrude, but still could not hold back. "Coffee is already on your desk, and today's agenda is in your inbox," he said quietly, and his voice sounded too even for him. Roman nodded without looking, but it was not his usual detached gesture. There was something hard and focused in it. For a second, Lev caught the way the alpha held his breath while reading the first lines of the report, and then exhaled sharply, as if forcing down the urge to smash something against the wall. During the first hours, the day clung to its usual form. Conference calls, signatures, short orders. Lev ran between departments, picked up documents, managed to answer emails, and at the same time tracked how the tone of incoming calls was changing. Partners sounded overly polite, lawyers spoke too fast. In the voices of the finance people, there was that strained, everything is under control, which usually meant the opposite. He did not know the details, and he did not try to find out. Curiosity rarely did an Omega in his position any good, but his hearing became sharper. Around Roman's name, in internal correspondence and quiet conversations, another word started to appear: scandal. For now, still a whisper, still in closed chats, but it was already alive. By lunchtime, Roman summoned him with a single short gesture. No name, no job title. Just a look that made many people's mouths go dry. Lev entered the office and stopped at the usual distance without crossing the invisible line. The light from the panoramic windows cut his eyes. A stack of folders lay on the table, next to a phone with a non-stop stream of notifications. The screen flashed several times with the familiar screensaver of a news channel, but Roman did not reach out to open it. He sat slightly reclined in his chair, with the expression he showed only to those who had seen him off camera. Not anger, concentrated fatigue of a predator who suddenly realized that outsiders' hands had been part of his hunt for far too long. Lev kept silent. His job had always been to be the background. To hand over the right paper at the right moment, to remind about a meeting at the right moment, to quietly steer unnecessary people away from the desk. His own opinion had never been on the list of responsibilities, but there was something hanging in the air that had nothing to do with ordinary tasks. He noticed the door to the reception area was locked from the inside. That happened rarely. Usually Roman preferred to control the space openly. Anyone could see him work, but few dared to enter without knocking. A lock this time meant there really should only be one way in. Lev caught his reflection in the black screen of the turned-off monitor. Unremarkable shirt, dark vest, a neat badge with the company logo. Not a single hint at his Omega status. Nothing that a gaze could latch onto. He had built himself like an invisible wall, and now this wall found itself alone with the man on whom the entire tower rested. Roman did not speak right away. At first he just stared somewhere over Lev's shoulder, as if he were still continuing an invisible conversation. When his voice did sound, it was lower than usual and strangely muffled, without the metallic overtone of authority. Lev caught fragments of phrases whose meaning formed into one cold picture. An external review, information that was never supposed to reach the press, photos no one should have seen. The name of his Omega husband flickering where the Volkov family were used to being paid for silence and spotless appearances. The scandal was not just looming. It was already inside, like a crack in glass, not yet visible from the street, but treacherously obvious from within. At some point, Roman, for the first time that day, shifted his gaze directly onto Lev. It was not the detached, assessing look Lev was used to. There was no interest in it, no familiar, condescending chill with which alphas watch staff. If Lev had not known better, he would have called it the look of a man who had suddenly noticed a piece of furniture and realized that it had eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt not just like part of the interior, but like a piece on the board that could be moved. And somewhere deep down, in the part of his mind responsible not for survival, but for intuition, a heavy, viscous premonition coalesced. In the coming days, they would demand from him not just ready coffee and printed reports. His quiet, overly neat existence would stop being safe. For now, he simply stood there, listening to his boss's breathing and the slow, uncharacteristically careful rhythm of his phrases, and understood the main thing. He, Lev, who had always been unnecessary, had suddenly become necessary to someone who, not as a person, as a convenient shadow to cover someone else's crack on a perfectly polished shop window. By midday, the tension stopped being just background and became the office's main content. As if the air conditioners were pushing not air through the floors, but dense, dry fear. The elevators arrived less often, people moved faster than usual, almost never stopping by the coffee points. Laughter disappeared. Only whispers remained. In the waiting area, where neutral business news usually ran in a loop, they suddenly switched to one specific channel. A familiar logo flashed on the screen, then footage of a society party. A slow zoom on a freeze frame. Volkov's Omega husband in a perfectly tailored suit, and next to him an unfamiliar alpha leaning in too close. Under the picture, a strip crawled with neat, poisonously neutral text. Strange contact. Sources report. Roman Volkov's team declined to comment. The photo itself proved nothing. But the hint had been made. In Roman's world, that alone was enough to trigger a storm of calls. Stock chats were already arguing about how stable the marriage was, the marriage on which part of the holding's image rested. Lev heard snatches of conversations as he passed open doors, the words shares, contracts, reputational risk, and the insidious what if sounded more often than any others. Roman was parrying blow after blow. He went into the video conference room alone and came out with the same tight, predatory expression. They pushed folders, tablets, phones toward him. He signed, checked, gave orders. Outwardly, everything looked like a routine work crisis. But Lev, who knew how to hear the silence between words, felt this was different. He serviced this chaos as always, made sure there were no empty cups left in the office, slipped the right documents under his hand. Rescheduled meetings, crossed off from the schedule what had become impossible today, and moved it to later, though he understood perfectly that later might not come. The office lived in a here and now mode, and long-term plans started to sound almost indecent. He tried not to look at the TV screen in the waiting area, but the news came back to him like an echo. In the courier's chat, someone forwarded a meme with the screenshot of that freeze frame. In the lawyer's thread, the phrase evidentiary base appeared. In the head of security's voice, Lev heard the line, "We need to cover our flanks before they go after the house." Each of these splinters slid under Lev's skin. Not because he sympathized with the Omega husband, that man was part of a shop window Lev could not reach, but because he knew very well how such stories ended. If the marriage cracked, the first to be hit would not be the man on the cover, but those who had been building the picture, and those who were easiest to replace. By evening, the office began to resemble a ship that still held on the surface, but where emergency kits were already being quietly assembled inside. People left for home faster than usual. Some lingered at the exit, glanced at news sites, then quickly closed the tabs and pretended they were in a hurry to catch the subway. No one wanted to be among the first names on the list when layoffs started. When half the lights on the floor went dark, Roman called Lev. Not with the call button on his desk, not through the internal messenger. He simply opened his office door, held his gaze on the secretary, and nodded inside. There was a weight in that nod that made Lev automatically straighten up. Inside, the office was filled with thick, closed silence. The phone lay face down, the laptop was shut. The windows, usually open to the city view, now reflected only the interior light and the outlines of the furniture. This was not an executive's office, but a temporary fortress with one defender and one witness. Lev took his usual position 2 steps from the desk. Over the years, he had measured that distance almost to the centimeter. Any closer would be too bold, any farther, too detached. Here, he was the perfect shadow. Roman did not beat around the bush. His phrases were short, honed like blades, a reputational attack, a leak to the media, suspicion of the husband's infidelity, a threat to major contracts where the term spotless image stood as a condition. He needed precise inside information, not rumors, not speculation, not what journalists would drag to the surface. What was actually happening? He spoke about the need for observation, to track movements, mark meetings, log contacts, to know where the Omega husband had been, with whom, how long, and in what state. This was not about bursting into someone's private life, but about collecting facts that would help fend off the next wave. The official security service was under suspicion. Too many eyes, too many people who could sell information on. He needed someone who knew how to stay invisible, someone nobody took seriously, someone used to disappearing in corridors and leaving no trace in systems or in other people's memory. "You," he did not say out loud, but Lev heard it even before his name was spoken. The choice was obvious. The Omega secretary who was always nearby, always at hand, with no loud biography and no relatives who might interfere. A person whose future life was tied to one alpha's decision. Convenient, safe, easily controllable. Lev listened and felt a thin, sticky tremor rising inside. This was not about overtime, not about additional reports, not about a difficult project. They were asking him to enter the personal life of someone he knew only from glossy pictures, to watch, to note, to pass on. To turn from an invisible part of the office mechanism into someone's personal living microphone. It went against those faint, blurred boundaries he still tried to maintain inside. Other people's secrets had always been a heavy burden for him. He already heard too much as it was. Accidental confessions in meeting rooms, interns crying in toilets, restrained breakdowns of managers who had just learned their projects were being shut down. Now they were offering him not randomness but systematic surveillance. A brief thought flashed through his mind. Say no. Say it was not part of his duties, that it was dangerous, that he did not want to. But that thought immediately broke against reality. He knew too well how his world worked. In structures like this, refusals were not debated, they were recorded. The moment you mark yourself as a problem, they stop trusting you with anything that matters. And later, they stop trusting you with anything at all. And when the time comes to cut staff, they start the list with those who once allowed themselves to say no. Roman did not frighten him directly. There was not a single phrase like, "you must," or else. But the very fact of who was asking and who was being asked was threat enough. Between the lines it read, "I am giving you a chance to be useful. Do not take it, and you become expendable." Lev stood there, listening, trying to separate his own fear from rational analysis. On one side lay risk, following a man who almost certainly had his own defenses. The chance of being caught, accused, thrown under the first wave of scandal as a lone executor. On the other side was a different kind of risk. Refusal, loss of his job. A fall into that segment of the labor market where Omegas were not hired into offices and not seated at reception desks. He had no family to go back to, no savings that could carry him even a couple of months without a salary, no backup plan. He had always thought he at least had his own internal code, not to intrude where other people's private life began. Now even that code turned into a bargaining chip. He felt his fingers whitening with tension around the notebook. His body reacted more honestly than his thoughts. He wanted to back away, to say, "Take someone else." But his tongue still belonged to the system he lived in. When the pause stretched, Roman tilted his head slightly. No threat, no plea. Just a statement. The decision had to be made now, in this office, without witnesses. Lev inhaled, exhaled, and heard his own voice sounding strange, dried out, as if it had been run through a filter. "I understand." It was not a direct yes, but there was no space for refusal left in those two words. He did not clarify where the limits of the surveillance were, how he should report, how long it would last. He had participated in enough corporate games to know any clarifications would serve as a convenient excuse to label him hesitant. Roman nodded. There was neither gratitude nor doubt in his eyes, only the familiar acceptance of the logical outcome. As if he had placed the right piece on the right square, he outlined just the logistics. The husband's events where it would be useful to be present as an unnoticed background, places he liked to visit without cameras, people to watch particularly closely. He named those Lev could turn to if he ran into a direct threat. These names sounded dry, pro forma, not the slightest hint of emotional support. On his way out of the office, Lev felt the world tilt slightly. The corridor he had walked every day looked the same doors, the same logos, the same people hurriedly packing their bags. But everything around had shifted by half a tone. Until that moment, he had been the secretary who was always extra, a man whose very existence it was convenient to forget, a figure beyond the reach of both camera light and shadow from someone else's scandal. Now that very invisibility had become the main weapon of someone else's defense, he passed the waiting area where the TV was still looping the same party footage. On the screen, his boss's Omega husband smiled at someone off to the side, easily, confidently, like a man used to attention. Below, the ticker repeated the same phrases: "Sources claim, anonymous insiders say." Lev caught his own reflection in the black gloss of the screen next to it, a tired shadow with a badge, someone no one had ever given a right to speak. And for the first time in many years, he realized, now it was precisely what this shadow saw and reported that could determine not only someone else's reputation, but his own entire life. That was how the job began, that was recorded in no regulations, described in no job description, and mentioned in no employment contract. A job where each of his steps became at once someone else's instrument and his own very thin edge of the abyss. The move happened quickly, almost silently. On Friday evening, Lev was still going back to his old rented room with its narrow bed and view of a gray yard. On Monday morning, he already had a key card and code to a small apartment in the same complex where the family penthouse of the Volkovs occupied the top floors. Officially, it was called a housing bonus for key employees. HR wrote about it in a dry email, added an addendum to his contract, got the signatures. In reality, it was a vantage point, a home in which Lev ceased to be just a secretary and became an eye that had no right to close. The apartment was neat, functional, without extras. A tiny kitchen with glossy cabinets, a bedroom with a low bed, a desk by the window with only other towers standing between the glass and the sky. Several sets of neutral-colored clothing were already waiting for him in the wardrobe. No bright accents, nothing by which anyone could easily remember him in a crowd. Lev noted it professionally. "They're preparing me to be invisible," he thought, running his fingers over the smooth fabric. He received the husband's schedule as a neatly formatted file. Not a secret document, but definitely not for wide circulation. Lists of charity evenings, meetings with foundations, shows, closed dinners, appointments with stylists and doctors. Between the big entries, there were blank spaces. They were marked with one simple term: personal time. Those blanks were now of the greatest interest. During the first days, Lev worked by the book. He reviewed the schedule and marked where he could accidentally run into him. He ordered food delivery from the same places the family's assistants usually used. He signed up for the same gym that appeared in the husband's timetable. He adjusted the times so his visits would coincide but not look intrusive. He quickly realized that the world of Volkov Group was not enough to understand the man living at the top of that pyramid. He needed a new skill, to learn to be background in spaces where he had never set foot before. The first time he saw Roman's husband in real life was in the complex gym. No cameras, no perfectly pressed suit. He stood by a treadmill, leaning his hands on the handlebars and breathed like someone who had held his back straight too long and had finally allowed his muscles to relax. Numbers flashed on the treadmill display. Lev did not focus on them. He watched something else. How the Omega's step faltered slightly when a neighbor passed by. How his shoulders automatically straightened when their eyes met. How the public mask snapped back onto his face in an instant, even if there were only strangers and sportswear around. "He's always on stage," Lev noted. Even here, in a room that smelled of sweat, rubber, and equipment, every movement carried that honed habit of being beautiful. Watching was easier than analyzing. Lev found the angle, listened to the ambient noise, took note of people he exchanged a few words with: the trainer, a couple of regulars, security. No suspicious figures, no secret touches from which a scandal could be constructed. His first report was dry. Location, time, those present. A line about the route, from the gym straight to the elevator, from the elevator upstairs, home. No delays, no strange stops. In the following days, he expanded the map. Cafes. In the husband's official schedule, these points did not exist. On paper, his day was filled with high meanings, meetings with foundations, interviews, receptions. But between them, Lev started to notice small detours. The car turned not onto the main alley but into a quiet side street. The driver lingered at a corner, giving the passenger a few extra minutes. And there, a neatly dressed Omega would order coffee to go in a small place where no one would ever roll out a red carpet for him. Lev sat at a neighboring table, pretending to scroll his phone, and listened. Exchanges with the barista, a couple of remarks about the weather, a rare admission like, "Make it not so strong today, please." There was no infidelity in these little things. There was fatigue. Back in his apartment, Lev opened his laptop and wrote another report. The cafe's address, time. The fact that the Omega was alone, without security. The fact that on the way there the driver had slowed down as if he were used to this ritual. Formally nothing. But in the structure of a life lived on display, these nothings added up to his only personal freedom. Over time, Lev stopped seeing only his boss's spouse in the subject of his surveillance. Behind the photos flashing on screens, a living, exhausted man began to emerge, holding himself the way actors hold themselves after the 100th take. On camera, he delivered the perfect smiling image. In salon corridors, at exits from events, in underground parking elevators, he allowed himself barely a couple of seconds of his real face, tight, angry, sometimes almost empty. Lev increasingly felt not like a spy, but like a witness to someone else's internal erosion. That was more dangerous. A spy needed only facts. A witness inevitably started to feel. It became especially clear at a charity gala where Lev showed up as a representative of the holding. Technically, he was. He arrived, signed the registration sheet, received his badge, took a glass of water, and melted into the crowd of those who had come for the sake of formality. On stage, they said all the right things. About help, about social programs, about the importance of big business contributing to society. Roman's husband stood in the front row, slightly turned toward the cameras. The Omega from the promo photos, flawless silhouette, flawless smile. Lev stood farther back, closer to the exit. From there, he could not always see his face, only his profile now and then, but he could hear his breathing between phrases. The small pauses when the applause had already faded, but the Omega still held his smile, as if afraid someone might see it fall. The quiet, "thank you," addressed not to the audience, but to some inner demand. After the event, Lev, as usual, headed to the parking area. He saw Roman's husband sink into his seat and not close the door right away. For several long seconds, he just sat there, staring at one point. From outside, it looked like a minor delay. Inside, Lev felt it was the only time that evening when he allowed himself not to be beautiful. That day's report, too, turned out dry. A list of official contacts, a couple of names that might interest security. Lev consciously left out what he had really seen. That silence before the door slammed. That barely noticeable trembling inhale. You could not put such silence into a spreadsheet. It became excess. Between stakeouts, he returned to the office. There, his life went on as before. Coffee for Roman, planning meetings, calls. But now a new hidden line was woven into the familiar rhythm. Sometimes one question from the boss, "What do we have?" was enough to make everything inside Lev clench. He learned to speak carefully. Only facts, only what could not be interpreted ambiguously. Address, time, people nearby, no assessments. No wording like "it seems" or "in my opinion." He cut off any field for his words to be turned into a weapon he had no intention of putting into anyone's hands. But the longer he stayed inside this double life, the more the boundaries blurred. He caught himself not relaxing even at home. Any sound in the corridor was perceived as a possible signal. Any knock at the door as the beginning of something he was not ready for. A phone vibrating at night triggered not the usual irritation, but an instant readiness to log information. He lived under surveillance not only because he was watching. He was being watched too. He knew it without confirmation. A couple of unexpectedly precise questions from the head of security, an overly timely call from Roman in the exact moment when Lev was in the same elevator as the boss's husband. These were markers. They had not left him alone on this field, but they had not left him free either. Paranoia became a professional tool. He checked the cameras in the entrance, the routes, the people who accidentally appeared near him too often. Sometimes it seemed to him that he himself had become the subject of someone else's report. At night, lying in his new apartment, he tried to break everything down into simple lines. There was Roman, the alpha who was protecting his image and business. There was his husband, an Omega who was possibly tired of his own image and was looking for tiny cracks of freedom. There was himself, Lev, an Omega with no supports who had become a conduit between these two worlds. He was betraying. Both of them. He betrayed Roman because he filtered information, leaving out emotional nuances that could become grounds for harsh decisions if someone heard them correctly. He betrayed the husband because he still watched him, recorded every extra step, every extra coffee, every delay on the embankment. Sometimes a simple phrase surfaced in his mind. "I must stop." Throw away the phone, not show up at the next event, not calculate the next route. But behind that phrase inevitably stood reality. In this city, a working Omega without a roof over his head turns from a subject into a commodity in a couple of weeks. Life under surveillance gradually stopped seeming like a temporary assignment. It became the new normal. He no longer remembered what it was like to look only at his own trajectory and not read others. He woke up thinking about where and whom he needed to see today, and fell asleep replaying in his head whether he had missed something important. With each passing day, he understood more clearly that he was not participating in the exposure of some glamorous affair for tabloids. He was slowly, carefully, almost clinically opening up someone else's fatigue, someone else's loneliness, someone else's attempt to survive in a golden cage. But it was already impossible to step out of that role. The choice he had not made in Roman's office kept making itself for him every day. The fitness club in the complex had always seemed to Lev an ideal place to dissolve. The same music, the same smells, the same movements of bodies. People there were busy with themselves, their reflections, their kilometers on treadmills. A shadow could quietly move between machines and mirrors without raising questions. That day the space seemed to shrink. He came on time, as always. Checked the schedule, compared time marks, assessed how crowded the gym was. All the corners he was used to taking were already occupied. A loud group was stretching on mats in the far corner. By the window, where there were usually the fewest people, A personal trainer was working with a client. Near the dumbbell rack, young alphas clustered, exchanging loud jokes. Only one elliptical machine was free, next to the treadmill on which Roman's husband was already running. Lev hesitated for a second, assessing the risk. Then he switched on his usual automatic mode. He walked over, set the resistance level, positioning himself so he would see the wall rather than the man beside him. He counted on the mirrors to reflect them as just two figures among dozens of others, but the distance turned out to be too small. At first, he felt only the rhythm of someone else's run. Even well-practiced movements. A slight tilt of the torso that betrayed hours with a trainer. The air around them warmed slightly from two bodies working side by side. The monitors blinked numbers that Lev barely registered. He focused only on the breathing, a little heavier than it should have been for someone used to exertion. He caught himself watching longer than necessary. Not the face, but the profile in the reflection. The line of the neck stretched like a string. The hands gripping the handrails tighter than was needed for a simple workout. The eyes looking not at the display but somewhere through the mirrored wall. Roman's husband did not register this gaze immediately. But an Omega who had spent years under camera sights knows how to distinguish types of attention. There is the gaze of admirers, sticky, adoring. There is the gaze of strangers, sliding, indifferent. And there is that special, wary, focused look that has no desire to come closer, but contains too much recording concentration. That was the look he felt. At some point he turned his head slightly to the side, ostensibly accidentally changing the angle. His gaze swept across the gym, lingered on Lev's reflection for a fraction of a second, and returned to the treadmill. But Lev managed to read it. He had been noticed. Not as background, not as just another customer, but as an element that was present too much. After the workout, everything became even more aggravated. In the locker room, Lev chose a locker in a different row, as he always did. Took off his shirt, turned on the shower, hoping the water would wash away not only the sweat, but also the rising feeling of exposure. But the space suddenly narrowed. He heard the familiar step, sensed the familiar scent of expensive perfume, which this time held more metal than sweetness. The Omega walked into the locker room calmly, like a man sure of his territory. For a second, their eyes met in the mirror. No words, just two very specific, almost tangible questions. Who are you and why are you here again? Lev instinctively looked away, picked up his phone, pretended to read a message. There was nothing on the screen but a generic discount notification, but his fingers automatically imitated busyness. He felt something dangerous tighten in his chest. The shadow that was supposed to dissolve had suddenly been caught in the light. The Omega said nothing. He only held his gaze a little longer than necessary. Then, just as calmly opened his locker, took out his things, changed, and left. No scenes, no questions out loud. But that short, wordless contact was enough for Lev to understand. The boundary of invisibility had cracked. The next day, he saw changes in the routes. Previously, Roman's husband moved through the city almost by ruler. Home, foundation office, salon, home, home, event, home, home, fitness, home. The routes were clear, honed, like a stage blocking. Now unease appeared in them. The car made an extra loop around the block before parking at the usual entrance. Sometimes the Omega got off one stop earlier and walked a couple of minutes, changing the side of the street. The schedule suddenly acquired random visits to shops that meant nothing except one thing. He was checking. Lev quickly realized that his presence was being tracked as well. In one shopping mall, the boss's husband unexpectedly changed floors, as if changing his mind about going into a store. Lev, following his algorithm, changed his route too. And in the reflection of a shop window, he saw their trajectories again dangerously close. He understood. They were watching him. Checking whether this unobtrusive secretary really accidentally appeared in the same places. The shadow had gotten an answering look. The reports he brought Roman became even shorter. He floundered between the desire to be honest and a growing sense that any phrase could become a trigger. His notes still contained addresses, times, the fact of new deviations, but he carefully avoided interpretations. It was a fine, dangerous balance. Speak too dryly and you might seem useless. Add even a drop of personal reading and you might start a mechanism that would destroy the man he was watching. That evening, when all this first settled in for real, The office was unusually empty. Most of the staff had left shortly after the workday ended. Corridors that were usually noisy were now filled with the soft echo of security guards' footsteps and the occasional sounds of cleaning equipment. Lev was gathering papers on his desk, checking whether he'd forgotten anything for the morning meetings, when he noticed the light in Roman's office was still on. That in itself was not surprising. The Alpha often stayed late, but this time there was not business bustle behind the door, but a dense, heavy silence. The kind in which you can't hear the keyboard or voices over speakerphone. Only the occasional movement of a chair, sometimes a quiet exhale. When the call came via the internal line, Lev was already composed. He walked into the office expecting to hear a demand for another report, but there were no printouts on the desk, no open files. Just a glass of water, a few empty coffee cups, and Roman himself, sitting in the half-dark by the window. The Alpha did not look like the man from the news segments. Less gloss, more shadow under his eyes. His jacket hung on the back of the chair, his tie lay coiled on the table. The scent of expensive cologne was mixed with a fatigue that could not be hidden. He did not start talking about surveillance right away. He did not ask for details, did not rush to check effectiveness. First, he needed something else, to make sure that the mechanism he was leaning on was still functioning. Lev felt it almost physically. The request was not in the words, but in how the Alpha looked at him, not as at a secretary, but as at the only person in this building holding two strings in his hands, one from the office upstairs, the other to the apartment downstairs. The questions sounded standard. Is everything under control? Is there anything he should know? Are there any direct threats? Lev answered as he had been taught. Clearly, point by point, without emotional evaluations, controlled deviations from the roots. Attempts to check if there is a tail, no recorded facts that could be interpreted as explicit infidelity. He voiced the phrases, but thought about something else. About that look in the locker room. About how Roman's husband held his breath before getting out of the car. About the way that fatigue could not be mapped onto any threat scale. Roman listened, elbows resting on the desk. His eyes stayed heavy, but his voice gradually reacquired its usual metallic frame. Information gave him a sense of control. Even if the truth was uncomfortable, it was better than not knowing. Lev noticed something had shifted between them. Before, he was simply an extension of the schedule, a human calendar. Now he had become something else. A conduit between two versions of one Alpha's life, the public, perfectly constructed one, and the private one, full of cracks. That pull was dangerous for both sides, for Roman, because dependence on someone else's gaze breeds vulnerability. An Alpha used to relying only on himself and on hard numbers in reports had suddenly become tied to the interpretations of an Omega sitting behind a thin partition. For Lev, because he felt too clearly how his own presence was starting to change the configuration of relationships. He was no longer an invisible shadow. He had become the only one who simultaneously saw the marriage's shop window cracking and the Alpha trying from the inside to keep it from collapsing. That evening, leaving the office, he caught a brief moment that did not make it into any protocol. Roman held him at the threshold with just a single word. Not an order, not a request. Just a quiet, unexpectedly human, "Stay another minute." Lev took a step back, and in that pause, all the roles disappeared for a split second. No boss and secretary. No holding company, image, brand. There was only one man desperately trying not to lose control of his life, and another who had already gotten too deep into it. The shadow had become visible, and it could no longer go back to complete invisibility. The night when everything finally spun out of control began in a mundane way, with a notification on the screen in the waiting area and a short ticker on a business channel that Lev first tried to ignore. He brought coffee, arranged the folders, checked his mail, and still, returning to his desk, caught a familiar surname out of the corner of his eye. Roman's husband. New photos, some unknown man next to him. A blurred background, camera flashes, a distance that was too close. Nothing that could be called direct proof, but enough for those who had been waiting for a scandal to blow it up to the size they wanted. The market updates reacted almost instantly. In analysts' feeds appeared words about reputational risks, instability of the family image, possible impact on partners' trust. Lev heard fragments of these discussions through ajar meeting room doors, and each time the voices carried the same note, not sympathy, not an attempt to understand, but the cold excitement of people who had sniffed out someone else's weakness. Roman that day was not a person but a knot of contacts. He went in and out of his office as if moving along a front line. A meeting gave way to a call to a confidential session with lawyers, then with PR. At some point, he stopped even taking off his jacket, only loosening his tie a little and then tightening the knot again before the next video conference. Lev serviced this marathon almost mechanically. Cups replaced each other one after another. Media monitoring summaries arrived on the table on time, along with brief security reports and printouts with stock charts. He felt the air thicken around Roman with tension, but did not allow himself to pause even for a second. Any pause in his work now would have been perceived as betrayal. By evening, the office had emptied. People left, abandoning glowing screens and half-finished tea in mugs. In other companies, the lights would have been turned off by that time. Here, only security remained, a few duty analysts on another floor, and Lev, who had not received explicit permission to leave. Roman sat by the window, but did not look at the city. His phone screen glowed on the desk, blinking with new notifications. He did not pick it up. At some point, he simply put the device face down, as if wanting to cut off the very fact that information was arriving. Lev stood in the doorway, waiting for the next instruction, and in the glass reflection, he saw not the confident alpha from business magazines. Before him sat a man whose life was falling apart, not only as an image, but also as a personal support. The marriage on which half of his public story had been built was turning into a field for other people's comments and bets. Roman was silent for a long time. Only once did he curse quietly, pressing his fingers hard against his temples. Then he finally took the glass of water Lev had set there long ago, took a few sips and wearily ran his palm over his face. "I don't control it anymore," slipped out of him quietly, almost to no one. Lev did not answer. No one expected words from him at that level of openness. He did what he did best, cleared the desk of unnecessary folders, carefully moved the laptop to the side, turned on only the desk lamp, leaving the rest of the office in soft half-darkness. The light became less harsh. The shadows stopped cutting the eyes. For some reason, these simple actions hit Roman harder than any reports and charts, perhaps because there was no calculation in them. One Omega was merely making the space around the Alpha less aggressive. The tension accumulated over the entire day was looking for an outlet. Roman began to speak, first in clipped, dry phrases, then more freely. About the board of directors waiting for a sign of weakness. About the media that would gladly ruin any story as long as it meant ratings. About family demanding he save face, offering nothing in return but pressure. Then, inevitably, the conversation turned to his husband. He did not call him by name, as if afraid the sound of his own voice would further erode the remnants of trust. He spoke in generalities, about habits, about joint public appearances, about endless interviews where they were both required to play roles, about how every gesture was now examined through a magnifying glass. In those short confessions, Lev heard what he had previously only been able to guess. Not just anger, not just fear for the business. There was the pain of a man who had suddenly realized he did not control even his own home. Lev listened and felt something shifting inside himself. He had always perceived Roman through the lens of hierarchy, an alpha, a boss, the owner of the system in which he, Lev, was expendable material. Now in front of him sat a man who smelled of exhausted, wounded strength. He stood by the chair, not daring to sit without being asked. Roman reached for the glass, his fingers sliding across the desk without finding it at once. Lev automatically moved the water closer. Their hands touched for a moment. The touch was minimal, not a firm grip, not a deliberate move, more an accident. But a nervous impulse ran through Lev's body. It was not the kind of contact office rules told you to pull away from. There was too much fatigue and human need to lean on something in it. He should have stepped back. He should have increased the distance and returned to his familiar role, but his legs did not obey at once. Roman noticed. A brief pause hung between them. It carried too many meanings at once. Misuse of power, a plea for closeness, a boundary test. For a second, something like a silent question flickered in the air. "Will you walk away now?" Lev did not walk away, not because he had been waiting for this and not because he did not understand the danger. More because all of this day, and many before it, had turned them into two figures stitched together too tightly by shared secrets. He had already been part of the zone no one else was admitted to. And now that zone was expanding, spreading over territory that by all rules was supposed to stay locked. Roman rose from his chair, took a couple of steps toward the window, and stopped. In the reflection, Lev saw his profile. Sharp, tired, unusually defenseless, his shoulders slumped instead of being squared up for the cameras. His hands were clenched into fists as if he were trying to hold inside everything that was breaking out. "I don't know who else to trust," sounded in the room. Quietly, dryly, like stating a fact rather than making a confession, it was neither a request nor an excuse. More an admission of weakness, he allowed himself, only because there was no one left around except the guards behind the door and the Omega who had already seen too much. In these words, Lev heard not only the weight, but also the danger. When an alpha with such power says he has no one to lean on, anyone standing nearby automatically becomes that support, regardless of whether he is ready for it. Lev took half a step forward, not toward Roman, but toward the desk, intending to retreat to the door and re-establish distance. But his heel caught the leg of the chair, his step faltered, his balance shifted. Roman turned just at that moment. They ended up too close. The usual professional meter between them vanished. Lev felt the scent of cologne mixed with sweat and burnt coffee. Saw how close the alpha's eyes were, without a mask, without a protective layer. And for the first time he did not see cold calculation in them. There was exhaustion, anger, humiliation from the photos and comments. And something else, a sharp, almost physical hunger for a touch that had nothing to do with power. A hunger that on such a night is easy to confuse with any other feeling. Roman reached out and touched the back of Lev's head. Too confidently for coincidence, too uncertainly for a premeditated move. In a normal situation, Lev would have almost reflexively pulled away. But now his muscles seemed to refuse to play the familiar script. "This is wrong," flashed through his mind. Too loud. Too late. Roman's lips found his almost roughly, as if he were trying to drown something inside himself with that kiss. Lev froze for a split second, then responded. Not because submission demanded it, but because in all the years in this glass tower it was the first time anyone had touched him, not as a function. Time in the office dissolved. The desk stopped being a work surface, the chair stopped being a business prop. The dimness, the reflections in the glass, the scattered documents, it all blended into one blurred scene. They both knew where that path led. Neither of them could claim he did not understand the consequences. The Alpha broke his own rule that personal and work must not intersect. The Omega agreed to a role that put a cross over any illusion of safety. But that night, in the balance between must not and want, the latter outweighed. When it was over, the office looked as if after a quiet but devastating storm. Shifted furniture, scattered papers, the desk lamp picking out isolated details. Roman stood by the window again, turned toward the city. Lev gathered folders from the floor, mechanically straightening what could be straightened. A heavy, dense silence hung between them. They both knew what had happened, and neither hurried to dress it in any form. Any words now would make it too real. Roman said only one thing. "Take the reports and go home." His voice was businesslike again, composed as if nothing had happened. But there was a new, barely audible note, the one that appears when a person tries to override the personal with an order and does not believe in its force himself. Lev left the office with a surprisingly steady gait. The security guards at the elevator did not even raise their heads. To them, he was the same secretary who always stayed until the very end. Only in his tiny apartment, where the walls smelled of cheap paint and old furniture, did the mask fall. He sat on the edge of the bed without turning the lights on and stared into the darkness for a long time. Two lines replayed in his mind over and over. The first, his official role. A spy watching his boss's husband, reporting on every step, holding in his hands a thread that could destroy someone else's life. The second, the new one, only just formed. An Omega who had become a secret fling for that very Alpha to whom he had before been nothing but a tool. Those two lines had intersected at one point, and Lev knew that the point of intersection was the most fragile and dangerous place in his life. The place where any mistake could bring down not only the carefully built image of the holding, but also his own future. He lay in the dark and listened to someone in the neighboring apartment turning on a late-night show, to water rushing in the pipes, to the entrance door slamming downstairs. The world went on with its usual rhythm, not knowing that one Omega in a glass tower had stepped over a line from which there was no way back. Morning came as if the night had been just a bad dream. The city hummed with its usual voices, the elevators in the tower carried employees up and down, card scanners clicked at their usual rate. In the lobby of the holding, no one knew that in one of the offices the boundaries between allowed and forbidden had shifted. Lev woke to the alarm, as always. His hand reached out to turn off the sound. His feet found the floor. Everything was familiar down to the smallest detail. Warm water in the shower, overly strong cheap coffee, a neatly ironed shirt. But his body already behaved as if the night had left a mark on it. His shoulders ached with unusual heaviness. A thin ache hid in his muscles, like after a long journey. His skin reacted more acutely than usual to the fabric of the shirt. The smell of his own shampoo seemed too harsh. He moved a little slower than he was used to, as if every reaction now passed through an extra layer of awareness. In the office, everything clicked into place like a diagram. Lev arrived earlier, as always, started the coffee machine, checked his email, aligned the stack of morning briefs. Right on schedule, quick, confident footsteps sounded in the glass corridor. Roman appeared on the floor, neither later nor earlier than usual. Lev lifted his eyes at exactly the moment his role allowed. The Alpha wore the same expensive dark three-piece suit, the same perfected expression of a man who did not allow anyone to see him tired. The scent, the same cologne, the same freshness of morning shower, but at the very bottom, almost imperceptibly, the residue of a sleepless night. Their eyes met for a second. The second was empty, no shadow of recognition, no hint of a question, no delay. Roman took the coffee from Lev's hands, threw out a short thanks, went into his office, and the door closed with its usual soft sound. From the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. Inside Lev, everything had changed. The body that for years had known its place, at the desk, in the corridor, in the shadows, now reacted to every sound connected with the Alpha. The click of the office door handle made his heart skip a beat. When Roman called his name, the air in his lungs grew denser. He tried to convince himself it was just stress. Any Omega in such a situation would feel something similar. Only in this dense, sticky anxiety other notes broke through. There was not only fear of exposure and not only guilt toward the man he was still watching. There was also that strange, pulling memory of someone else's hands, of warmth, of how his own body, for the first time in many years, had not felt superfluous. Every evening he returned to his small apartment and tried to break what had happened into pieces. His logic went in circles. He told himself it had been a mistake, a breakdown, a reaction to the blow to the Alpha's reputation. That Roman would come to his senses, bury the subject, never allow himself something like that again. That the best thing he could do was exactly the same. Pretend the night had never happened, keep working until the storm blew over, but his body was not listening to logic. The smell of cologne followed him home. Just opening the wardrobe where the jacket hung that someone else's hand had once touched was enough to sharpen the memory. The skin on his neck seemed to recall someone else's breath. At night, his dreams blended with reality. He did not see scenes of passion, but details: the dark office, the lamplight, the loosened tie, the hoarse exhale by his ear. Meanwhile, the outer life had no intention of stopping for the sake of their private drama. Surveillance of Roman's husband continued. After another leak of new photos, Roman tightened the protocols. He demanded precision, reports, timings, names. Again and again, Lev wrote down other people's routes, other people's meetings, other people's exhaustion. Every time he returned from these assignments, he went into the office, laid out dry lists of facts. Roman nodded, skimmed them, asked clarifying questions. Both of them carefully stayed within the limits of a business tone. Only sometimes, when Lev's hand brushed the desk and Roman's fingers touched the same sheets of paper, that same current ran between them, the one their skin remembered more than either of them wanted. A couple of weeks later, the first strange symptoms began to appear. At first, Lev blamed the schedule. A night with an Alpha, then several sleepless, nerve-wracking days, endless work, lack of proper food. No wonder his body reacted. Morning nausea seemed like a logical continuation. Dizziness in the elevator, too. In his head, he recycled the usual excuses: not eating enough, not sleeping enough, too much coffee. But very quickly, he realized it wasn't just exhaustion. Coffee suddenly stopped smelling like salvation. The aroma that once meant the start of a working day now triggered revulsion. A wave of protest rose in his stomach as soon as he breathed in from the mug. In the break room, just looking at greasy food made him sick. His head started aching more, not with a sharp migraine, but with a dull, constant hum. By evening, he felt as if after a long rush-hour commute, though he had spent most of the day at a desk or in a car, the cycle he was used to went off as well. And Omega, who tracked his calendar almost by the hour, suddenly found the timing did not match. At first, he marked it as another trace of stress. Then, as a worrying sign, he started counting weeks in his head, comparing. Every calculation led to the same conclusion he wanted to turn away from. "No," he repeated to himself, "this is too dangerous. I can't." This shouldn't have happened. But his body was not interested in the word "must not." One evening, coming home after a particularly hard day, Lev almost fainted right in the elevator. The metal box swayed, the air became too thick. He had to brace his palm against the wall, wait for the cab to reach his floor and step out, pretending everything was fine. There was a 24-hour pharmacy next to his building entrance. Its sign glowed dimly, like a small, obtrusive signal. He usually walked past. That night he stopped. The purchase turned out humiliatingly simple. A few packs of painkillers, basic vitamins, and between them a thin box the pharmacist rang up in the same even tone as everything else. No one asked questions. No one looked at him suspiciously. To the world, he was just a tired office worker. At home, he did not take the bag out of his backpack for a long time. He paced the room, changed his clothes, put the kettle on, mechanically folded his clothes. The apartment felt cramped, the air thick. Every object seemed to hint that he would soon have to rebuild this life. When he finally took the box out, his hands trembled slightly. Simple instructions, simple steps. All he had to do was follow them. The bathroom was small, with a worn mirror and a dim light. The white plastic of the test looked alien against the old tiles. Lev caught his reflection and barely recognized himself. Hollow face, shadows under his eyes, tense mouth. He did everything as it said. Left the test on the sink, turned on the tap to drown out the sound of his own breathing. The seconds stretched into a thick, sticky mass. The instructions named a number, how long to wait. His body did not know how to wait. It already knew. He forced himself to turn away, walked out of the bathroom and pressed his forehead against the cool wall in the hallway. Variants flickered in his head. If one line, then blame it all on stress, on a breakdown, on that night. Keep living as before. If two, the word "if" broke apart. He only went back into the bathroom when the waiting time had clearly passed. His gaze first caught on a crack in the tile, then on a bead of water at the edge of the sink. The test remained a white rectangle until he forced himself to look lower. 2 lines. They appeared clearly, without any haze, leaving no room to blame interference or a faulty strip. 2 thin lines of color that split his life into before and after. For a second, his mind went blank. As if all the city sounds, the entire noise of the glass tower, all the voices he was used to hearing had been switched off at once. Only his own pulse remained, heavy, dull, uneven. "No," he whispered without realizing it. "No, no." But the lines did not vanish. They were not a dream, not a joke, not a scene from someone else's movie. They were a fact. Chemical, biological, merciless. Lev sat down on the edge of the bathtub, his legs weak. His hands lay on his knees, his fingers clenched into fists. Questions were already starting to surface, each more frightening than the last. What would Roman say? Would he tell him at all? What would happen to his job? What would happen to the child if the boss decided this pregnancy was a threat to his image and business? For now there was only one answer. His body had made the choice without him. Now he would have to make his. If you've listened this far, pause. Leave a like and write in the comments what you would do in Lev's place. Is it important to you that he tell the alpha right away, or would you also try to hide? Your response helps us understand which way to develop future stories on BL's Story of Love. Pregnancy for an Omega in the world of glass offices was not happy news. It was an extra item on the risk list, a figure that instantly changed all calculations. For Lev, 2 straight lines on white plastic did not mean the promise of a new life. but the feeling that his own life was beginning to crack at the seams. He sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time, until the water in the tap had cooled and the light above the mirror began to seem too bright. His thoughts ran up against one simple, blunt truth. He knew who the child's father was. There could be no mistake. His calendar contained no dates, no flings, no nightclub hookups, only the office, work, rare stakeouts. And one night, when he crossed everything he had taught himself, Roman's name surfaced in his mind like a forbidden command. The alpha boss around whom his working world had been built was suddenly becoming a figure in his personal, intimate story. Not a fantasy, not a quiet, safe crush he could avoid admitting. A fact that could no longer be removed from his body. His brain instantly started building scenarios. They flashed one after another like alarm lights. In one scenario, Roman treated the pregnancy as yet another lever of control. An Omega secretary carrying the boss's child was a convenient reason to keep him even closer, even tighter. In another, the Volkov family found out first, the elders, the board, the lawyers. There, the child turned into a reputational threat, a potential scandal. In a third, Lev himself was branded a manipulator. An Omega who planned it all for benefit, who got pregnant on purpose, who decided to chain an alpha to himself. In every scenario, he lost. The thought of simply telling him and getting support looked too naive. Lev knew too well how power worked. Interests called the shots here, not words. No major alpha would voluntarily acknowledge a child with a subordinate Omega while contracts, a marital union, and the press's attention were hanging over him. The first thing he did, a primitive self-preservation instinct, was choose silence. He hid the test in the furthest compartment of his wardrobe, where old payslips and useless documents lay. He shut the door as if he could lock away both the lines and the fact. Sat on the edge of the bed, pressed his palms to his face, and took his first deliberate breath since seeing the result. Nobody. For now, nobody, he formulated inside. The next morning started with the same alarm, but now every action came with a new question. Can I take this medicine? Is this shirt too tight? How long can he hide the changes? At work, he returned to the role of the ideal secretary. He still prepared coffee for his boss, but no longer touched espresso himself, sticking to water. He explained the change of habits neutrally. After stress, his stomach had become picky. Roman nodded and did not probe. Eye contact he avoided. It was convenient to hide behind monitors, folders, doors. Any extra glance was a dangerous reminder of what now connected them beyond meeting schedules. The surveillance of the alpha's husband continued. No changes there. The same routes, the same empty pauses, the same reports. Perhaps it was the cold mechanics of this part of his life that kept Lev from breaking down immediately. As long as he watched someone else's exhaustion, he could push his own to later. Meanwhile, he started counting. Not only weeks, but money. His salary, by the city's standards, was pretty good, enough to cover rent, food, meds for his chronic issues, but not for a decent clinic, tests, and childbirth. Any assistance program for Omegas meant registration, paperwork, the father's name in a box where it could not appear. The people who processed that paperwork inevitably leaked the information sooner or later. Scandal would be a matter of time. He tried to imagine what would happen if he left the holding. His resume would be a few lines about working for a major alpha, his Omega status a mark read without words. A pregnant Omega with an ambiguous father, no connections, no support. Low-end agencies, dirty jobs where one's body was the only advantage. The cage was pushing its walls closer. At some point, another idea appeared, one people rarely voiced, a medical way out, to end the pregnancy before it became visible. Solve the problem before it could be seen. Return life to its previous course, albeit with one more crack inside. Lev caught himself opening clinic websites in his browser. The text was dry, neat, with the right words about health and patient rights. Prices were listed separately. Deep inside, resistance rose, but his rational mind stubbornly repeated, "This is the most logical option. The safest for everyone." He made an appointment for a consultation at a private clinic on the other side of the city. He did it at night, almost mechanically, as if booking the boss in with a dentist. He sent the request, got a confirmation, wrote the address and time in his notebook disguised as an ordinary meeting. On the day of the visit, he took a day off, citing feeling unwell. HR processed it easily. The secretary, who had not taken sick leave in years, finally burned out. Roman, buried in meetings, only glanced briefly at the empty desk and switched to the next report. The clinic was sterile to the point of anonymity. White walls, soft light, smiling staff. Here no one asked extra questions as long as you paid on time. The doctor he was sent to was a mid-aged Omega with a tired but attentive gaze, his voice neither soft nor harsh. Professional. The examination was quick and detached. A few clarifying questions about timing, health, whether there was an alpha partner. Lev's shoulder twitched slightly at that, and he replied evasively. The doctor did not press. When it came down to the heart of the matter, a pause hung in the office. The silence was dense, uncomfortable. You understand, the doctor said, no longer quite so mechanical, that formally we can perform the procedure. But with your indicators, there is a risk of complications, not only now, later, up to the point that the next pregnancy may never happen. Lev stared at the little plastic model of a uterus on the desk, trying to align it with his own body, with the numbers in his file, with his age and the fact that in his life he had never had a real chance at a family. It's your decision, the doctor added. Not mine and not your partner's. Either way, it'll be you living with it afterward, not them. The phrase sounded unexpectedly honest. On the way home, the bus rocked evenly and monotonously. Stops, shop windows, and people flashed outside the windows. Inside, everything condensed into a single thought that crowded out the rest. This child might be the only one. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a medical one. One chance his body had given him without warning. And if he now decided not the right time, not the right format, not the right circumstances, there might simply never be another right. The fear did not disappear. He could still clearly picture Roman's face freezing into a cold mask if he found out. He imagined the possible pressure from the family, legal threats, an even tighter cage. But alongside the fear, another, quiet, almost inaudible note appeared for the first time. Responsibility not to the alpha, not to the company, not to the image, to the one who already existed inside him, for now only as a cluster of cells, a pulsing dot on a screen, but existed nonetheless. That evening, back in the apartment, he took the hidden test out of the wardrobe. Put it on the table, next to it, a sheet of paper and a pen. Tried to make a list of pros and cons the way he used to before big decisions as a child. The pros looked weaker, but they were his. The cons were loud, weighty, but largely other people's. At some point, he stopped writing and just looked at the one line that required no explanation. I don't want to betray my body again. His life was already full of compromises, after which he had stopped respecting himself. Agreements he had entered into out of fear to survive. One more such decision promised a quick pragmatic result, but would leave too deep a trace. He realized there was now only one exit for him. He would keep the pregnancy, not because he believed in a fairy tale about an alpha who, upon learning, would rush to him with declarations and protection. Not because he wanted to use the child as a chain, but because it was the only decision in which he remained on his own side. The plan was born from that choice automatically. For now, silence. Save up at least a small financial buffer. Find a doctor willing to monitor the pregnancy without extra questions. Learn to hide the changes under his clothes for as long as possible. Prepare for the moment when hiding would no longer be possible, and the truth would inevitably hit everyone. But unlike all previous decisions in his life, this one had not been imposed by someone else's power. For the first time, he chose for himself. If you've listened this far, write in the comments whether you think Lev is right to keep the pregnancy, or if you see another way out. Your feedback helps BL Story of Love tell Omega stories so they truly resonate. Secrets in his life had always depended on the same thread. As long as no one looked too closely, he could breathe. But pregnancy was a state the body could not hide forever, even if the mind desperately tried to. In the first weeks, Lev managed. Loose shirts, carefully chosen trousers, layered outfits. He learned to rise from his chair smoothly so his head wouldn't spin, planning ahead when to slip away to the bathroom to ride out a wave of nausea behind a locked door. A bottle of water stood by his keyboard, and he grabbed it whenever his stomach knotted in protest. Every day, this carefully staged performance demanded more effort. By evening, he felt as if he had worked not one but 2 shifts. Back in his rental apartment, Lev often just collapsed onto the bed fully clothed without turning on the light. The same questions kept spinning in his head: when it would start to show, how much time he had left, what he would do when he no longer fit comfortably into his office chair. Roman noticed changes in his own way. At first, as work glitches, the secretary who had once scheduled without error now occasionally got the time wrong. The man who had always been on his feet now twice allowed himself to sit on the couch in the waiting area while the boss was out of the office. Lev's voice had become a little quieter, his movements more careful, like someone carrying something fragile inside himself while refusing to admit it. The alpha put it down to overload. The crisis around the marriage, the surveillance, the news, constant tension, even a strong Omega could crack. But his habit of seeing threats where others saw fatigue did not disappear. In the rare minutes when Roman allowed himself to tear his eyes away from the phone and simply look at his secretary, something about him set off alarms. The way Lev held a folder, the way he sipped from his water bottle in tiny gulps, the way he avoided touch, although there had been very little of it even before. The tipping point looked almost ridiculous. A normal workday, a long corridor where light from big windows hurt the eyes. Lev was carrying a folder with board documents, juggling in his head a list of tasks in Roman's schedule for the next few hours. At some point, his vision darkened. The world lurched for a second. He did not even have time to swear. His knees buckled, his foot slipped. The folder started to fall, and with it, he. The hand that caught his elbow appeared out of nowhere. Strong fingers gripped his arm through the fabric of his suit, keeping him from hitting the floor. With his other hand, Roman grabbed the folder so it wouldn't scatter its contents. It all happened so fast that from the outside, it looked like nothing more than a boss's quick reaction to a subordinate's clumsiness. For Lev, it was the second in which all the fear he had carefully hidden turned inside out. His body responded on its own terms, his scent changed. A warm, deep new note appeared that no clothing, no water, and no excuses could cover. The alpha sensed it at once. With all the sharp animal clarity honed by years, pregnancy, not theoretical, not possible, not hypothetical, real, here. One step away from him, time stopped for a moment. Roman looked at Lev a little longer than corporate etiquette allowed. His gaze slid from his pale lips to his eyes, and then, almost imperceptibly, to the line of his abdomen, still hidden by his clothes but no longer empty. He needed no tests and no lab results. In the closed spaces of the holding, that scent could not be confused with anything else. "Damn!" slipped out of him barely audibly. From the tone, Lev understood the moment he had been trying so desperately to postpone was over. Silence no longer worked. Everything he had hidden had come out in one sudden, honest fact. After that, the day rolled downhill. Roman had to postpone his reaction. Meetings did not get canceled because of personal shocks. The company's stock did not climb back up because the alpha stood leaning on his desk, trying to digest the thought of a child conceived in his office. But inside, everything shifted. Every planning session, every advisor's call sounded muffled, as if through glass. By evening, he told the secretary to stay late. The short phrase, spoken in an even tone, revealed nothing. But its shade was such that Lev felt another point of no return approaching. At the same time, in another part of the city, in that same glass tower where the family penthouse was, another line was unfolding. Roman's husband, long living in an atmosphere of tension and suspicion, finally got what he had been missing: direct proof that he was being watched. It did not come through a dramatic exposé, but through a tiny accident. A not quite deleted message on an escort's phone screen. A photograph in whose reflection a familiar silhouette could be made out in a shopping center corridor. CCTV footage from a club where Lev's face flashed in the background. One glimpse, another, a third, and the picture clicked. And Omega, who had long suspected he was being controlled but had hoped for some scraps of trust, suddenly saw that his movements had long been turned into reports. Someone from the inner circle, possibly straight from the office, had been noting where he was, when, and with whom. His indignation was not loud but cold. He came home not with a tantrum, but with resolve. Roman's phone burned with the first message, with no affectionate addresses. Just facts. He knew about the surveillance. He had seen the person. He would no longer play the role of a pretty part of the display. By the time Roman returned to his office to talk to Lev, he was already under double pressure. On one side was his husband, confronting him not with infidelity, but with the fact of control. On the other was his secretary, whose pregnancy was undeniable and would inevitably hit their already cracking marriage. The conversation in the office was brief and heavy. Lev was on one side of the desk, Roman on the other. Between them lay invisible but clearly tangible evidence. The scent, the exhaustion, the tremor in the Omega's fingers as he gripped the edge of his trousers to steady himself. And the memory of that night they both tried not to recall, but which had now become too corporeal to avoid. Roman did not ask, "Are you sure?" He did not ask the kind of questions that would have twisted Lev with hurt. The Alpha looked at him as if trying to calculate all the risks, losses, and possible moves at once. There was fear in his eyes, but not of the child as such, of what his life would turn into when this truth got out beyond this room. At the same time, his phone buzzed non-stop. His husband kept writing. Sometimes a single word, sometimes whole phrases. The screen flashed with messages saturated with cold, offended rage, surveillance, lack of trust, humiliation. 2 lines of truth that had long existed in parallel had finally met in one knot. Roman stood in the middle of the room with the phone in his hands, and in front of him sat Lev, gripping the fabric of his trousers, and the world shrank to a single point. The secretary was no longer an invisible element of the system. He had become the eye of the storm, a spy who had been exposed, an Omega pregnant by his boss. A potential scandal for the holding, a blow to the marriage, a threat to the reputation. From that moment, the question was no longer moral. No one was asking who was more to blame, the one who gave the order to spy or the one who agreed. No one asked whether the husband was right to see betrayal in the surveillance. It all narrowed to the practical, how each of them would dispose of the life Lev carried under his heart. And precisely then, Lev felt most clearly that to them he was not only a person, he was the point where interests crossed, a piece on the board around which the players gathered. He still had to decide whether he would remain a piece or try, despite everything, to step beyond the edges of that board. If you've listened to this moment, write in the comments on BL's story of love, whom you understand more right now, Lev, Roman's husband, or the Alpha himself. Your thoughts help us see the story from different angles and set the tone for the next chapters. The scandal could not stay inside the walls of the office in the penthouse. The world Roman lived in worked differently. Any crack in the facade instantly became content. The influence of his family, the interest of the press, the scent of blood around big money, all of it turned a private catastrophe into a ready-made plot for morning shows. The first attempts to put out the fire looked professional. The lawyers sent out letters, the PR team prepared dry wording about unreliable information, a few tabloids received stern warnings. But all of that was already a fight with smoke, not with the fire. Rumors went out on the wind, catching on every ear willing to listen. Anonymous sources began popping up in opinion columns as if on cue. Former employees, distant relatives, someone who had once stood in line next to Roman's husband. They talked about tension in the family, a long-broken union, a secret Omega from the office. Half-truths, quarter-truths, and pure fiction all blended into one sticky mass. Roman's official marriage was cracking not only under the weight of headlines. Processes no one wrote about had been going on inside it for a long time. Agreements once signed between 2 adults began to fall apart. A husband who now felt surveillance on his own skin could no longer pretend they were on the same side. And the pregnancy of another Omega became not the beginning, but the final nail. There was no pure villain and no pure victim in that union. There were 2 people who had once agreed to a marriage that gave protection and took away air at the same time. An Alpha who had taken a husband as partner to look progressive and strengthen his position. An Omega who had agreed to the marriage in order to get a place in a world where lone Omegas have their wings broken far too easily. Between them, there had been attempts at intimacy, genuine smiles, and exhaustion that had been piling up for years. Now that fragile balance collapsed. For the first time, Roman faced a choice for which no business case and no risk model had prepared him. Until this moment, any decision could be broken down into numbers, loss of shares, penalties, reputational costs. Here, something that could not be counted forced its way into the formula. Someone else's dignity, his own guilt. A child no one had planned, but who was already a fact. The first option was obvious and familiar to the world he'd grown up in: preserve the marriage at any cost. Pull old levers, use connections, intimidate the press, cut deals with tabloids, cast Lev as a manipulator. Translate everything into a familiar narrative. A greedy Omega seduced a successful Alpha to secure his place via a pregnancy. Pay him off, sign a strict non-disclosure agreement, send him far away, preferably to the other end of the country. The world would nod. That's what people do. That's how it's done. The second option was shorter and heavier. Admit that the facade was ruined, that the marriage, which had already been held together by residual agreements, could not withstand another hit. Not try to plaster over cracks on rot, file for divorce, knowing it would hurt contracts, his position on the board, stock ratings. Expose himself to the judgment of family, shareholders, and those who treated this union as part of a strategy. He chose the second, not because he suddenly turned into a romantic hero, more because the first strategy demanded even more victims. To save the facade, he would have had to crush completely the one who was already standing on the edge. And by that point, there was already a feeling sitting inside him that would not let him repeat the old script. Responsibility. The divorce did not become an act of nobility. It was an admission of defeat. With himself, with the system, with that part of his family that had always believed personal feelings came second to business. Family advisors gathered around an expensive table and said all the right words. They offered polished moves, delay the official statement, stage a few joint appearances in front of the press to dampen the wave. Frame the pregnancy as an attempt by a third party to interfere in the family. They talked about the profitable side of the story, about how to save face and minimize losses. PR specialists brought scenarios. In one, Lev became an obsessive fan who needed to be pitied and bought off. In another, he was a simple mistake that could be mentioned in passing in an interview without details. Out in the margins, there were figures, deadlines, contacts of journalists ready to write in the right tone. Lev in those schemes was not a person but a piece, a variable to be sacrificed. Roman listened to them the way he had once listened to investment proposals. But now what hid behind the dry phrases cut deeper than any numbers. Every time someone said, "This Omega can be," the voice involuntarily reminded him of his own relatives, of how they used to discuss people as assets, without noticing that one such asset was standing in the next room. He caught himself being unable to say aloud the prepared sentence about the payout and leaving. The word stuck, and that stuck was not weakness, but the one remaining sign that he had not yet finally turned into a machine. The decision ripened in the same silence in which he had once decided on a hostile takeover. Only back then the stakes were measured in billions, and now, in 3 lives, he announced the divorce first privately, to his husband, his family, his closest advisors. Without scenes, without shouting. He simply put a period in a sentence that had been going on far too long. His husband met the news not with hysteria, but with the tired, burnt-out calm of a man who had long been living in expectation of the end. There were no beautiful farewells between them. There were legal phrases, division of shared property, arguments over shares, negotiation of terms. For the public, they prepared a neutral text, a press release stating that the couple had mutually decided to separate while maintaining mutual respect. Magazines tore that phrase into quotes. Some were more interested in the size of the possible settlement, some in who would get a new partner first. Only a small part of the coverage cautiously hinted at a third party, not yet daring to say any names. At that time, Lev lived like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether he had already jumped or was still standing there. Outside a narrow circle, only a few knew of his existence, but that was enough to make the air around him denser. People in the office began looking at him differently. Not openly, but with that wary curiosity with which you study a landmine. Some colleagues suddenly became overly polite. Others, on the contrary, avoided contact as if afraid to catch his problems. He heard fragments of conversation in the corridors. Not his own name, of course, but enough phrases to understand that rumors had seeped inside. They say there's some story with an Omega from the office. Better stay out of it or you'll drown yourself. With his connections, they'll get through it anyway. At night, he lay in the dark and counted not sheep but options. Leave first, before any decision came from above. Ask for his final pay, take his severance, try to disappear. Go to a state clinic, formalize all the paperwork officially without naming the father. Tell Roman everything he thought of him and of himself, and leave while his legs still carried him. Every option ran up against reality. A pregnant Omega without support is easy prey. Any agency, any help would turn into new control. There wasn't a single number in his phone he could call in the middle of the night and ask for a bed for a couple of weeks. His passport carried only his place of birth and nothing that could protect him. Roman understood this in his own way. He saw how Lev had become even quieter, even more cautious, how he almost stopped lifting his eyes, how every time he was called into the office he walked in like to execution. And inside, Roman himself, the question grew louder. What would he do with the person he had placed in that point? The easy path still lay right in front of him. Sign a few papers, have one conversation, transfer money. Hand Lev an envelope, say that this would be better for everyone, and close the story the way he had closed dozens of others. But every time he ran that script in his head, something balked. His memory served up not only that night in the office, but the days. How Lev had been there for years, invisible, neat, precise. How he had carried out orders, including dirty ones, not because he loved him, but because he had no choice. How now, in the corridor, he held onto the wall so he would not fall and still kept walking toward the printer. Responsibility stopped being an abstract word. It became a heavy physical sensation, like a stone under his ribs. This was not a sudden flare of tenderness and not the epiphany of true love. It was a simple, almost down-to-earth understanding. He had taken a step for which he had to pay not only with money. The divorce ended formally. Signatures, seals, statements. The marriage that had been maintained for years for the sake of the picture did not hold. In one day, the penthouse lost its family status. Photographs came down from the walls into closed folders. Joint contracts went into reformatting. The world pretended it understood. Some sincerely sympathized with the husband. Some rejoiced. Some calmly calculated how the power balance would now shift. Only 3 people knew the full price of that change. Roman's husband gained freedom, but along with it, a scar no cosmetic interview could hide. Roman got rid of the facade but lost the shield he had hidden behind for so long. Lev was left with a child and with a void, instead of a future where there had at least been the stability of a work routine. And against the backdrop of that collapse, there was one decision everyone around Roman had considered obvious that he never made. He did not hand Lev an envelope with tickets and did not say a cold disappear. That refusal to walk the familiar road became the first invisible point where the marriage finally died and a new, strange, still unformed family began to exist as pure, heavy obligation. If you've listened to this moment, write in the comments on BL's Story of Love whether you see Roman's choice as weakness or, on the contrary, as his first honest step. Your thoughts help us see where the facade ends and real responsibility begins. The decision did not ripen overnight. It seeped into Lev slowly, like cold water through cracks. In the mornings when he hunched over the sink from nausea, in the office when he felt himself looked at once as a problem and as a convenient lightning rod, in the evenings when he returned to the service apartment and caught himself thinking that there was not a single place in that city he had come to by his own choice. The role he'd been pushed into spread over his skin like a sticky film. Spy. A shadow set to watch someone else's marriage. A lover who happened not according to plan. A pregnant Omega already mentally broken down into legal cases and PR schemes. Each passing day strengthened the feeling that the only part of his life that belonged to him was what was growing inside. He understood that if he stayed, everything would be decided for him. Where to live, what to say, how his pregnancy would be presented to the world, as a mistake, as blackmail, as an unfortunate fling. His child would become a token on someone else's board even before birth. And the very fact that he saw this made staying unbearable. At night, the city seemed a little more honest. Without the wound-up gleam of screens, without streams of people, the glass tower of Volkov Group stood like a huge black box with its electric guts humming dully inside. Security shifted into night mode. Guards took up posts. Cameras looked at their usual angles. Lev knew the schedules almost as well as he knew his boss's meeting calendar. He knew at what hour the guard on the lower level went out to smoke on the stairs, what time the parking attendant turned to the monitors, how many minutes the elevator would stand at the service floor if called from outside. He began to assemble his escape the same way he had once assembled reports, out of tiny details. In advance, he carried part of his savings out of the apartment, cash he had kept for a black day. He unhooked his access card from his keychain and left it in his desk drawer, a small act that guaranteed it would trigger an alarm in the morning. He kept his documents close to his body, the only things that let him be someone on paper. Not much fit into the bag. A couple of changes of clothes without logos so as not to catch the eye. A simple gray hoodie instead of an office shirt. A small first aid kit. A couple of packs of vitamins a corporate doctor had once prescribed, just in case. No gifts, no keepsakes from the tower. Even the mug he had grown used to in the office kitchen he left on his desk, the way you leave part of yourself in a place you don't plan to return to. He really did throw out the test with its 2 clear lines into the trash, not because he wanted to forget, more because he no longer needed proof. His body reminded him every morning. And that thin piece of plastic belonged too obviously to life in the tower, a life where any object could easily turn into evidence. He left the way he had lived all those years, quietly, no notes, no long looks at windows where someone might be awake. The elevator, where he stood gripping his bag strap until his fingers went white. The empty corridor on the service floor, lights flickering dull yellow. The door that opened onto a service exit he had seen many times on evacuation plans and never once used. Outside, the air smelled different. Not of conditioned sterility, but of a real mix of gasoline, damp, a night bakery, and a distant river. The city hummed with a low bass that contained not a single note tuned to anyone's presentation. Lev raised his collar, slung his bag over his shoulder, and walked. He wasn't drawing any big map. His vector was simple, away from the district where any window could be a lens, away from the center where the news was discussed over dinner as casually as the weather. He moved, counting intersections as steps. 1 block. Another. Another. The address he pulled from the depths of his memory was almost forgotten. Once, years ago, before Wolkoff Group, he'd had a colleague at a cheap agency. A beta, an old hired soul used to surviving on the outskirts. She did not know the details of his current job, but once, during a last smoke break by the back entrance, she said, "If you're ever really cornered, I'll always have a spare mattress." The spare mattress turned out to be a narrow sofa in a small room in a shared apartment. Thin walls let every sound through, neighbor's television, someone snoring, clinking dishes in the night. The window looked out into a narrow courtyard where no journalist would ever point a camera. No one here cared who you were by status. The only things that mattered were whether you paid your share of the utilities and whether you let others sleep. The bag that had felt heavy when he left the tower looked laughably small in that room. Lev put it by the wall, sat on the edge of the sofa, and for the first time in a long while allowed himself to just listen to his own breathing. Without the background noise of meeting rooms, without the rustle of expensive suits behind the walls, without that dense sound the closing doors of boardrooms made in the tower. A pregnancy left without corporate trimmings became closer and sharper. Morning bouts of nausea could no longer be hidden behind the high sink of a spacious bathroom with the water running. In the shared kitchen, every gag reflex echoed, and after a couple of days, a neighbor just snorted, "Got food poisoning too?" He nodded, unable to explain. The heaviness in his body grew like a stretching rubber band under his skin. His normal clothes started to pinch, climbing stairs became harder. Sometimes the baby, still just a small knot, seemed to protest against walking too fast, and Lev would stop in the middle of the street, lean on a cold railing, and whisper into the empty air, "Easy. Please, easy." Money was disappearing faster than he had calculated in his night of resolve. The last salary went on rent, food, basic tests at a cheap clinic where they didn't ask who the father was. Any more serious doctor would have demanded his employer's name, insurance, extra details. Those were all threads leading back to the tower. He looked for work like a man trying not to stand out and not to drown at the same time. Any mention of his previous position meant a risk of recognition. He replied to ads that didn't ask for references, that paid cash and didn't demand extra questions. Temp jobs, sorting documents in a small firm on the outskirts, a night shift taking delivery orders, anything that let him keep his head above water for now. Hiding the pregnancy became harder by the day. Loose clothes only helped to a point. Then people's gaze started to snag on his belly. Some just looked away out of their own form of respect for privacy. Some started counting out loud. "You're going out on your feet pretty late, Omega." Those remarks made him want to disappear. Sometimes, coming back along gray streets in the evening, he caught himself still adjusting internally to Roman's schedule. Running through what meetings the boss would be having at that time, how his voice would sound at the briefing, what shade would appear in his scent when he got angry. The habit of living inside someone else's life did not let go. Somewhere underneath those thoughts sat a thick, almost physical guilt. He had left without a word. Left not only his boss, but a whole situation where there was another side. Roman's former husband, the family, the lawyers, the PR people. And whatever was happening between them now was unfolding without his participation, but not without his trace. In the glass tower, he tried not to think about. They did notice his disappearance. Not immediately. The first few hours they wrote it off as a delay or a glitch in the schedule. Then, as an error in the access system, the card lay in his drawer and showed in the building, but the person was gone. Security worked the standard protocol. Checked cameras, called his basic contacts, sent requests to hospitals and stations. For them, Lev was a mid-level employee, but with access to a top manager's office. His disappearance was seen as strange, but solvable. For Roman, the empty desk outside his office was a blow he was, oddly enough, less prepared for than for divorce and a falling stock price. For the first few days, he honestly tried to experience the disappearance as relief. "It's easier this way," he repeated to himself, looking at the empty chair. No more spy, no more pregnant Omega at his elbow, no extra link in the chain of blame. The situation becomes more manageable, but the practical voice was quickly drowned out by other noises. The silence in the hallway became ringing. No one opened the door at the right time to remind him of a meeting. Coffee in his office appeared either too early or too late because the new assistant did not feel his rhythm. Documents arrived in stacks without being prioritized, and he caught himself being irritated by details he had never even thought about before. In the background, services were working to find Lev. Personal requests not formalized on paper. A few calls to the same cheap agencies where both of them had once started. A couple of questions to people who had known Lev before. Some of them had to answer, "No, he hasn't been in touch." With each day, the absence stopped being a convenient emptiness. It turned into a hole, not only in the daily logistics, but also inside Roman himself. For the first time in a long time, he found himself in his own world without that quiet man who had been near him for years, never asking for a place on stage. Lev did not see this. He lived in his tiny room with flaking paint on the ceiling, counting the cash left in his wallet, calculating how many days it would stretch if he bought only the bare essentials. Sometimes he pressed his palm to his belly and whispered, "Hang on, just a little. I'll think of something." Return was not part of his plans. Only pursuit featured in his fears. His reality was the slow narrowing of the corridor between "I can still manage" and "I can't do this anymore." But in the stories told on BL's Story of Love, a runaway rarely becomes the final point. More often, it is only a regrouping before old paths cross again in a new place. Pregnancy never followed a schedule. By the time they ran into each other again, Lev's belly could no longer be hidden by oversized sweaters and a stooped walk. At a cheap clinic on the outskirts, he was known as that quiet Omega with the watchful eyes. No one there cared whose name stood in the father's box. His file held a dash, and the doctor only snorted, "The main thing is that you yourself carried a term." After another checkup, he wanted only one thing: to sit somewhere that didn't smell of antiseptic and finish the pastry he'd bought on the way. The cafe next to the clinic was ordinary, with smudged tables and a coffee machine that groaned as if it might die any minute. That was precisely why it was safe. People in expensive suits did not come in there. No one held business meetings or filmed stories. Lev chose a table by the wall, sank onto the hard chair, and felt his body, worn out by the appointment, spreading into tiredness. His belly pressed heavily against the edge of the table. His back ached. The doctor had just said a dry, "Everything matches your term," and his own thoughts were stuck somewhere between fear and dull relief. The baby was alive. For now alive, beyond that, unknown. He almost didn't hear the door open. Only a scent turned his world around. That same cologne, muted by expensive tobacco and fatigue. The vibration of footsteps recognizable even through the coffee machine's noise and patrons' low conversations. Lev's body reacted before his mind did. His fingers clenched around the paper cup, his breath skittered. He did not believe it right away. This man was not supposed to appear there, among peeling walls in a cheap menu. Roman Volkov belonged to glass towers, conference halls, and restaurants where tables were booked weeks in advance. But it was exactly him standing at the entrance, scanning the room with that tense focus Lev knew down to the last millimeter. Roman had not brought security, wasn't walking ahead of a wave of assistants and aides. He wore too simple a coat that still could not hide the posture of someone used to owning any space. He saw Lev almost at once. Not because Lev stood out, because he was looking for him. The meeting happened not through security, not through lawyers, not through private investigators he had indeed set on the trail. In the end, it all boiled down to the fact that one day, a clinic name showed up in an analyst's report, paid by a strange transaction from a card still linked to the company payroll. A minor detail that passed unnoticed by accounting, but not by his eyes. He came himself. For a second, the cafe felt cramped. Lev felt everything inside him tighten, not only from fear. Alongside the usual, now he will take everything away. Another feeling flickered, a furious, almost childish thought that he had a right to his small life without him. Roman sat down opposite him without asking permission, but also without taking his space away. The table was narrow. Any misstep would have made them too close. He deliberately kept his hands visible, did not reach towards Lev, did not try to touch his belly, though his gaze kept sliding back there against his will. Silence hung between them. Not the dry business silence in which deal decisions matured. Another kind. Thick, heavy with everything that had piled up over these months. The escape, the divorce, the scandals, the commentary, the absence. "You disappeared," his look said. "I had to," Lev's look replied. They did not say the phrases out loud. And that was probably the best thing that could have happened. Any excuses would have sounded cheaper than silence. Roman spoke first. Not with the hard voice he used to slice air in conference rooms, not with the soft tone he used to flatter investors. His speech was shorter than what Lev was used to hearing from him. There was no pressure in it, only a fact. He had been looking, for a long time. At first, because it was part of control. Then, because the emptiness left by his secretary's absence turned out not to be just a logistical problem. And at some point, because the man who had gone away, taking with him not only the ability to sort documents, but also part of Roman's own conscience, had started visiting in his dreams at night. Lev listened, but not as a subordinate anymore. Pregnancy had made his world brutally concrete. Rent, tests, food, work, everything else he could allow himself to let pass by. He did not need confessions of guilt. He did not need long monologues of regret. He cared about one thing: what exactly this alpha planned to do with the fact that the child existed. The conversation did not go toward feelings, and that made it more honest. Roman did not ask for forgiveness. He understood that any sorry would sound like another tool, not a state. He spoke about boundaries, about the fact that he acknowledged paternity, that he had already initiated the divorce and did not intend to hide the child in the youthful mistake box, that he was ready to provide housing, medical care, protection, and that at the same time he had no right to demand Lev's return. For him it was a new experience, framing proposals without a hidden threat and without an inner only if. He was used to dividing people into those he controlled and those he made deals with. Lev had suddenly ended up in the second category. Lev listened and thawed very slowly. Roman's words still held the old habit of counting, calculating, controlling. But layered over that was a tone he had never heard from this man before: uncertainty. For an alpha of his scale, it sounded almost unnatural. Uncertainty not about whether he could pay, fix, protect. Uncertainty about whether he had the right to ask. For the first time in a long while, Lev felt he had space for an answer, and not only an obligation to obey. He formulated his conditions. Without pretty turns of phrase, almost dryly like an invoice. He needed a roof, but not the tower. Not a return to the penthouse, and not the role of a temporary lodger in a flat where every object would remind him of someone else's life. He wanted separate housing, not luxurious, but his. Somewhere with no cameras in every corner where he could decide for himself whom to let in. He needed work, but not secretarial work. He no longer wanted to be the one through whom all the trash of other people's decisions passed. He wanted to perform tasks where his skills would matter and his status would not remind him of his former dependency. Let it be remote project analysis, consulting on internal communications, any role where he worked with documents and not with someone else's calendar. He needed a say in decisions about the child. Not only alimony and a surname, but the right to joint decisions about schools, doctors, routines. The right to say no if he sensed the child was being turned into part of someone's image. And the last condition, spoken almost in a whisper but sounding loudest of all, no more shadow. No more secret assignments, anonymous surveillance, ambiguous roles. If he came back into Volkov Group's orbit, it would be only as a person, not a tool. It was not an ultimatum, more an internal declaration. Lev understood perfectly that formally, the power still lay on Roman's side. He could offer less, could try to pressure him out of habit. But in that case, the deal would not happen at all. Roman listened carefully, the way you listen to a report when too much depends on it to let your thoughts stray. With each new phrase, it became clearer. There was no way to regain full-scale control over Lev's world. The man sitting opposite him had stopped being the perfect secretary who's always expendable. Roman had to acknowledge him as an equal partner in this one, but crucial matter. He accepted all the conditions. Somewhere inside, maybe, he left himself the right to try to expand his zone of influence later, when the fear subsided. But said aloud, the agreement was surprisingly clear. Housing, separate in Lev's name, paid for by Roman but legally belonging to Lev. Access, without hidden cameras and without security dropping by every other day. Work, in a different department with the option to walk away at any moment without the threat of losing health insurance. The child, officially recognized with written attention to the fact that decisions were to be made jointly. And above it all, the unspoken but crucial point: no more spy assignments. No requests to see who is meeting whom, no night stakeouts. Lev was no longer to be the eyes that would then be turned against him. The legal part of that agreement later grew papers. Lawyers drafted contracts, notaries stamped them. The documents contained dry wording about maintenance, rights, and obligations. But the main agreement was made at that table in the cheap cafe, between half-drunk coffee and cold pastry, where once they had been connected only by the vertical line boss-subordinate. A thin, still shaky, but real horizontal line appeared. Not of love, and they were far from that yet, of honesty, of recognizing that they were both responsible for a life they had brought into this world, and for the one who carried it. When they walked out into the street, the world had not become softer. The frosty air still cut the lungs, cars still honked. Somewhere downtown, people discussed another Volkov Group deal. The divorce continued to be processed, the holding's image to be rebuilt. But something shifted inside Lev. The cage he had built around himself, fortifying the line between himself and Roman, developed a crack. Not because the alpha had suddenly become perfect. Because for the first time, instead of an order, there had been an agreement, and inside Roman, a new, unfamiliar point appeared in his internal code. Until that day, he had been responsible for employees, numbers, assets, shareholders. Now, 2 more people were added to that list, without the option to cross them out, the one walking beside him with a slightly rounded gait, and the one whose heart was still beating quietly under Lev's palm. The new agreement did not cancel the past. It did not erase guilt, pain, betrayal. But it gave a chance for this story to have a continuation not pre-written by press offices and other people's fears. Over time, their life really did stop resembling a continuous stream of emergency bulletins. Crises still happened, but no longer tore the fabric of reality every day. They flared up like distant storms, audible, visible, but not shaking the house to its foundations. The press from time to time dragged that story back into the light. They recalled the divorce, the scandalous Omega, the fall of elite morals. A column, a segment, a comment from some supposedly independent expert. All of that lived somewhere out there, beyond the glass. In the kitchen of the new home, at that same moment, soup could be quietly simmering. The child could be dropping a spoon on the floor, and Lev sighing in annoyance as he wiped up another stain. Roman's family did not give up. Older relatives tried to reclaim control in the ways they were used to. Phone calls with hints, invitations to family dinners where they gently nudged him toward more convenient solutions. Family lawyers sent occasional letters softly reminding him what a respectable alpha's life was supposed to look like. But on another level, something was happening that no letters or articles could undo. After moving to the new house, Roman, for the first time in his life, found himself in a space that had not been designed for the camera. The house was smaller than his previous apartments, with no high ceilings or endless corridors. A small living room, 2 bedrooms, a balcony looking not over the city panorama, but over neighboring rooftops and a thin line of trees. The windows were not always clean. On the windowsill stood crooked little seedlings planted by the child, none of whose names anyone knew for sure. Here Roman was learning to be not an owner, not a predator, not a symbol. A father. At first it looked foreign, a night tantrum of a child who could not be soothed by any lullaby or toy. Lev sitting on the edge of the bed, worn to transparency. And Roman, standing in the doorway with the same lost expression he would never take into a press conference or board meeting. Dark circles under his eyes, a bottle of formula in his hands he was only just learning to mix properly. He slowly grew into those everyday roles. Diapers that at first seemed harder than a financial report. A child seat he stubbornly tried to assemble without instructions, then still peeked at the scheme. Trips to the clinic where his status gave him no privileges except the right to hold the child's hand himself while the nurse gave a shot. At night, when Lev collapsed from exhaustion and fell asleep as soon as his head touched the pillow, Roman paced the room, rocking the baby. In those moments, instead of the cold confidence, another mode switched on in him, a ringing responsibility from which you could not hide behind stock charts or a last name. It was not a sense of duty to the clan, not care for the holding's heir. It was a plain, heavy, I am here. At the same time, Lev was learning something else, not to dissolve. He had spent too long in positions where his existence depended on someone else's schedule, voice, mood. First in the world of agencies and temp gigs, then in the glass tower where he had been a secretary no one saw until needed. The habit of being convenient had seeped into his skin. In the new home, that skin had to be changed. At first, he caught himself making automatic moves. Clearing Roman's desk before he stood up. Tweaking the day around his meetings, though he was no longer secretary. Silently agreeing to any initiative even when something inside protested. The rule they had once spelled out at the table in the cheap cafe required a different behavior. Lev had to have the right to say no, and that no was necessary not only for him, but also for the child who grew up absorbing models. He learned to say it aloud in simple things. No, tonight's dinner would not be from a restaurant, but from what was in the fridge, because the child needed real food, not leftovers from hotel kitchens. No, that photo with the baby would not go to the press even if PR thought it would humanize the image. No, he would not go as a +1 to some loud event where he would be shown off as part of a new pretty story. Roman tensed at those refusals at first. The reflex to get a default yes still lived inside him. He was used to resistance eventually breaking under money, pressure, or explanations of benefit. But each time Lev calmly repeated his no, without raising his voice or justifying himself, the usual script glitched. Gradually, this built a different axis between them. Not a vertical, from the one who orders to the one who obeys, a horizontal one. 2 adults, tired, imperfect, but at least trying not to turn the other into a tool anymore. The house became the material trace of that shift. The hall was often a mess. Small shoes abandoned in the middle of the rug, a jacket flung over a chair, a kid's backpack spilling crayons. Before, Lev would have tidied all that in the first minutes, striving to restore the usual order. Now he sometimes intentionally left that chaos until morning, because it was not the absence of control. It was the sign that people lived there. Guests came rarely to the new house, and only those both of them wanted to see. There were no usual parties to celebrate deals, where instead of close people, the room filled with business partners solving their issues over a glass of champagne. No obligatory family dinners with relatives for whom every visit was an inspection. Instead, a couple of Lev's old friends came by, and Roman learned to see them without the internal question, what use will they be? 2 or 3 people from his own team dropped in, those who had gone through the crisis together and remained not just employees. None of them glanced around searching for hidden cameras. There were no secret surveillance devices in this house. No one set tasks to track who talked to whom and for how long in the kitchen. If Roman caught himself on the old reflex, I should know everything, He walked out onto the balcony, smoked his cigarette to the end, and only then went back in, leaving the impulse outside. Meanwhile, Lev was also shifting in his work. The promise not to put him back into the secretary's chair was kept. He no longer sat in front of the office door, no longer lived waiting for any phone call. Instead, he worked on projects where his eye for people really mattered. He analyzed internal communication in departments, read threads, listened to voice messages, helped structure processes so employees wouldn't turn into disposable material. He chose the format himself, sometimes working from home while the child slept, sometimes from a small office with no Volkov name on the wall and no heavy nameplates. Paradoxically, that format made his presence more significant. Where before he had been counted as a shadow, his opinion was now listened to as a resource. And every time he rejected a proposal that clearly turned someone into a tool, his sense of self-worth grew stronger. Roman was changing too. However much he resisted inside, his predator image was cracking, not because he had suddenly become soft and safe. He could still be harsh when defending the company or the home's boundaries. But now his coordinates held a new stable point that could not be ignored. How will this affect those two, not only in money or status, in breathing, in sleep, in trust? Where earlier he would have signed a contract without a second thought, he now had to calculate not only percentages, but also the possible cost for a child who would one day grow up and ask, "What were you doing then?" Their relationship did not turn into a perfect love story. There were arguments. There were days when Lev wanted to pack a bag and leave because old wounds rose too high. There were nights when Roman, his forehead in his hands, realized he still knew no way to talk about his fears other than through orders, and irritation spilled out. But they now had a tool they had never had before: honesty, at least enough to call things by their names. If Lev noticed Roman looking at him the way he used to look at subordinates, he could say so. If Roman realized Lev was driving himself back into the role of an invisible shadow, he could remind him that in this house, that behavior was no longer required. The child grew up amid this imperfect but living balance. For him, the norm was not that adults are always right, but that adults can be wrong and admit it. Not that an Omega must be obedient and grateful just for a roof, but that he has a right to boundaries. Not that an Alpha always decides and controls, but that responsibility is not only order, but also the ability to stay when it would be easier to run. The house they lived in truly stopped being a display window. Its facade no longer served others' expectations. It was not perfect, sometimes noisy, sometimes tired, but real. No one spied on anyone there. Everyone took their steps openly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes wrongly, but not hiding behind glass. Lev was no longer a secretary clinging to an office chair, because beyond it there was only an abyss. He became a man who had passed through the role of spy, of convenient tool, of culprit in a scandal, and managed to pull himself out of all those definitions. Roman stopped being just the alpha from business magazines, the cold manager for whom people were lines in a report. His biography now held a chapter where he did not buy himself peace, but chose to stay near the one whose life he had once broken. The story for the BL Story of Love channel has come to an end, but their life has not. If you've listened all the way to the end, write in the comments which moment hit you hardest: the order to spy, the night in the office, the 2 lines on the test, or the escape. Don't forget to subscribe to BL Story of Love and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next forbidden BL story. Take care of yourself and your right not to be anyone's shadow, even if the whole world is used to seeing you only as a secretary in the background.